Running has become the new way of existing. Chase after anything with intensity, and your soul will be touched, possibly shattered. It feels as though we have entered a kind of dark age for rest. Restlessness has become one of the great unifiers of our time. It doesn't matter who the person is or where they live. Everyone seems to agree on a single point. The way people live today is fundamentally unsustainable. They may disagree about the causes or even about what exactly has collapsed inside, but there is a silent consensus. Something has broken in the human experience when so many different people converge on the same exhaustion. Seneca already had an ancient name to describe this state: agitation of the soul. Serenus was a cultured, powerful man with everything Rome could offer. Even so, he wrote to the philosopher saying that he felt trapped in a kind of diffuse malaise that he could not name. He was not sick, but he was not well either. He was not standing still, but he was not moving forward either. It is from this dialogue that the work On the Tranquility of the Soul was born, and it is striking how the portrait Serenus painted of himself fits, word for word, into the life of almost anyone who is watching right now. The restlessness described came and went like a tide. Moments of calm, followed by a sudden urge to change everything. Change houses, change routines, change purpose. And then, in the middle of the change, the same empty feeling as before. Serenus said he felt like a boat rocking inside the harbor, not leaving, but not resting either. That image may be the best description ever made of the modern human being. A body seated in an ergonomic chair, a mind out on the open sea. The computer screen turned on, 3 browser tabs open, a notification sound in the background, and inside, that silent question no one has the courage to ask out loud. If everything is going well, why does it hurt so much to be here? The Roman philosopher's response contains a sentence that still echoes today. It is not the world that agitates the soul. It is the soul that projects its inner turbulence onto the world. This inversion changes everything. Because, in modern logic, exhaustion is always the fault of work, of traffic, of demands, of the system. It is never the fault of the way one thinks. It is never the fault of the way one desires. It is never the fault of the internal rhythm one accepts as normal. And yet, that is exactly where the problem lives. A man can change countries, languages, time zones, and still keep waking up with the same tightness in his chest. This doesn't happen because the new country betrayed him. It happens because he carried inside his suitcase the very thing that produces that tightness. The interlocutor in that dialogue had a curious complaint. When he dedicated himself to books, he felt he should be taking action. When he acted, he felt he should be studying. When he rested, he felt guilty. When he worked too much, he felt used. It was as if, in any position, an inner voice whispered that the right place was somewhere else. The author of the Moral Letters recognized in that description one of the oldest ailments of the human being, never being where you are. Instead of offering a miraculous technique, he offered something harder, a mirror. He told his friend that this restlessness did not come from life, but from the relationship he maintained with life. It came from a poorly adjusted expectation. It came from a culture that taught the Roman citizen, and today teaches the American citizen, the European citizen, the citizen of any corner of the connected world, to believe that there is always a better state, and that the current one is always insufficient. He wanted a quick answer, a method, a technique, a step-by-step plan. What he received was slower and more effective. He received a re-education of perception, because agitation, in the Senecan diagnosis, is a habit of looking, a habit of always looking at what is missing, never at what is there, a habit of always projecting satisfaction into later, never recognizing it now. And habits are not broken by techniques. They are broken by the patient repetition of the opposite gesture. That is why no cure in 1 week was ever promised. What was promised was an entire lifetime of inner work, in which, little by little, unrest lost ground to a serenity that grew ever more stable. What was offered there was a path, not a product. And paths, unlike products, demand time, a lot of time. Perhaps that is why modernity preferred to invent products. There exists, at the heart of Senecan philosophy, a brutal but necessary distinction between being busy and being alive. In the work On the Shortness of Life, we find the assertion that most men complain that life is short, when in truth, they have never lived it. They have merely passed through it. Constant busyness became, then and now, an elegant disguise for inner emptiness. A man who runs around all day looks important. A full calendar looks like a full life. But this theatre is dismantled with surgical coldness. Being busy with many things is not the same as doing something great. Often, it is merely running away from anything that requires depth. And this is where the viewer needs to pause for a second, because modernity has taught a dangerous equation. Whoever does more is worth more. Whoever responds faster is more competent. Whoever sleeps less is more dedicated. That math, however, has never added up. Among senators and merchants, the Roman philosopher observed men who died rich and empty, who had crossed decades without a single hour dedicated to thinking about their own existence. Men who knew by heart the laws of the forum, but who did not know why they were alive. And the worst part is that this logic has not changed. It has only changed clothes. The senator became the executive. The slave became the app delivery driver. The merchant became the digital entrepreneur. And exhaustion, which used to be the exclusive property of the powerful, is now democratic. Everyone runs, everyone appears to produce, and at the end of the month, everyone asks themselves why their bank account keeps growing while their peace keeps shrinking. No one would agree to lose a single denarius without a fight, but everyone hands over their days without charging anything. The day is the only asset that, once lost, never comes back. That is the currency the ancients knew how to count. It is the currency modernity has forgotten. No one would keep $1 in a pocket with a hole in it. Yet everyone keeps entire years of life in a routine they know is leading them nowhere. And they call that responsibility. The thinker from Cordoba would call it something else: sleepwalking. In his letters, he described men who spent their whole lives planning to start living later, after retirement, after a certain number in the bank account, after the children grew up, after a stage that never arrived, because every stage completed generated another. And when those men finally stopped, they discovered they no longer knew how to live without running. They didn't know how to be silent. They didn't know how to look at the afternoon sun. They didn't know how to sit with their wife without checking their phone. They had lost the intimate vocabulary of a simple life. And retirement, which was supposed to be a time of rest, turned into a second anxiety, now without the disguise of work. This is what the Stoic tradition called a spent life. Not a life lived, a spent life. Like a piece of clothing worn until it frayed, but never worn on an occasion that deserved it. And the harshest blow this philosophy delivers to modern exhaustion has not yet been struck. What is still missing is the quietest turn, which will appear in a few moments, about where exactly restlessness lodges itself when no one is looking. The central mistake, which runs through all of Senecan philosophy, is to believe that unrest comes from the outside. In almost all his letters to Lucilius, the Stoic master insisted that the malaise is internal. He wrote a sentence that is perhaps the most painful in the moral letters. You ask why the trip didn't help you. You brought the same man with you. That is why changing cities does not cure. Changing jobs does not cure. Changing relationships does not cure. Because the same brain, with the same patterns, with the same attachments and the same comparisons, boards every new phase of life. And weeks later, the scenery has changed, but the restlessness remains the same. This is what makes someone leave a company exhausted, enter another thinking it was a fresh start, and in 3 months discover that the only new thing is the badge. The environment changes, the internal functioning does not, and as long as that inner logic is not touched, each external change is only one more turn on the treadmill. Marcus Aurelius, who read Seneca carefully before writing his Meditations, would later arrive at the same conclusion. He said that men seek refuges in the countryside, at the sea, in the mountains, when the only true refuge is one's own mind. This is not mysticism, it is a practical observation. Because external noise is limited, there will always be a wall, a door, a pair of headphones. But internal noise is infinite. It does not ask for permission, it does not respect a schedule, and it is that noise, in the end, that decides whether a Sunday afternoon will be peace or torture. A man can rent a cabin in the Colorado mountains and spend an entire week listening to his own judgment, his own resentment, his own fear. Another can live in a tiny apartment in New York and, even so, find within himself a place of silence. External geography does not decide this. Internal geography does. Epictetus, who also influenced the entire Stoic tradition, said with his rough clarity that man is not disturbed by things, but by the opinions he forms about things. It is a small sentence, but it reorganizes the whole world, because traffic in itself does not generate anger. It is the opinion that traffic is a personal insult that generates anger. Rain in itself does not generate sadness. It is the opinion that the rain ruined the day that generates sadness. A rude comment in itself does not wound. It is the opinion that that comment defines who you are that wounds. The author of the Moral Letters developed this in practice. To train the mind is, above all, to train opinions. To choose the stories one tells about what happens, because what happens, almost always, is neutral. Suffering enters through the mental commentary that follows the event. Here, we need to look at the most current version of this escape. Modern human beings have built incredible tools so they no longer need to be alone with themselves. A person in a bank line in Chicago, another at a cafe in Berlin, a third at a bus stop in Sydney, all make the same instinctive gesture. They take their phone out of their pocket. Not because there is something important to look at, but because the emptiness of 10 seconds without stimulation has become unbearable. Something similar was observed in Rome. Men who filled themselves with banquets, with spectacles, with noise, with useless commitments, with one single secret goal: not to have to meet themselves. Because meeting yourself without distraction is to see up close what you have been avoiding for years. A lukewarm marriage, a meaningless job, a friendship that has become a habit, an ambition that isn't yours. The screen of the cell phone, in the end, is the same banquet described in antiquity, only portable and free and infinite, and that is why it hooks people with a force the ancients could never have imagined. What one discovers when the distraction ceases is too uncomfortable for most. One discovers, for example, that a good part of what one chases was not chosen. It was absorbed. Absorbed from advertising, from comparison, from social pressure, from the standards of one's own family. The worst slave, said the Stoic master, is not the one who knows he is chained, but the one who loves his own chains. And the most frightening thing about modern life is precisely this. The chains have become invisible. They have disguised themselves as success, as status, as a collection of experiences, as a full life. And anyone who tries to point this out sounds like a killjoy. But the truth is simple. A busy life does not necessarily mean a life lived. Often, it is the opposite. A full calendar can be the most sophisticated refuge someone finds to avoid looking at themselves in the mirror. Every commitment is an alibi. Every email answered is proof that there was no time left to think. And if there was no time left to think, the life chosen by inertia keeps rolling on without anyone having the courage to interrupt it. A study conducted by researchers at the University of Virginia, published in 2014, showed something revealing. Volunteers were placed in an empty room, without a phone, without books, without any stimulation, and invited to remain there for 15 minutes, alone with their own thoughts. There was, in the room, a button that delivered a small electric shock to whoever pressed it. Most of the participants, especially the men, preferred to give themselves a shock rather than remain in silence with themselves for that stretch of time. It is a terrible image, and at the same time, a perfect one. The modern human being prefers known pain to inner silence. If he had read that experiment, the Roman philosopher would have simply nodded with sadness. He already knew. He had already described it. He had already warned. And 2,000 years later, a university room in the United States merely confirmed, in a laboratory, what Roman philosophy had diagnosed at the very heart of imperial life. And this is where the invisible engine behind all this trampling of the soul appears: desire. On this point, the thinker from Cordoba is relentless. In the letters to Lucilius, he writes that poverty does not consist in having little, but in wanting much. That sentence is a silent bomb, because if taken seriously, it reconfigures the definition of wealth that the world has been repeating for centuries. Rich, in the Senecan view, is not the person who accumulates. It is the person who needs little to be at peace. And the tired one, whether the ancient tired or the modern tired, is always the same. He is the one who wants everything: a perfect body, a brilliant career, an admired family, a house in 2 cities, a deep relationship, a travel schedule, a comfortable bank balance, an enlightened spiritual life, and of course, free time to enjoy all of it. No one can bear that weight. No one was made to carry so many ambitions at the same time. And yet, that is what is silently asked every single day upon waking up. Each satisfied desire does not bring rest, only another desire. It is like drinking salt water trying to quench thirst. The more you drink, the thirstier you get. A new car brings joy for a week, then it becomes scenery. A new job title excites you for a month, then it becomes routine. A bigger house fills your chest for 6 months, then it needs more furniture, more renovation, more maintenance, more things. The ladder of ambition has no top. And modernity has turned that ladder into an endless corridor, with an algorithm on the wall reminding you, with every scroll of the thumb, everything that is still missing. The Roman philosopher didn't know the infinite feed, but he described, with the precision of a surgeon, the soul it produces. A soul exhausted by comparison. A soul that has lost the ability to feel like enough. A soul that no longer knows where its own desire ends and where inherited desire begins. An American billionaire, interviewed a few years ago by a widely circulated newspaper, said a sentence that would stay with people. He confessed that, over the years, each significant increase in wealth came accompanied by a brief moment of euphoria and, right after that, by a new ambition, a new standard of comparison, a new social group that made him feel behind again. He said he discovered, too late, that the number in the bank account would never be enough, because the problem was never the number. The problem was the inner mechanism that produced the desire. The author of the Moral Letters would have nodded. He had already written exactly that to Lucilius. In other words, saying that the man without an inner life will never have enough goods on the outside because each acquisition only widens the emptiness. That is why Stoic philosophy is so tough on excess, and the toughness does not come from moralism, but from a fine engineering of the mind. Excess feeds the mechanism that produces thirst. It does not kill it. There exists, inside this machinery of wanting, a tyranny that goes unnoticed. It is the tyranny of the future. Men suffer more in their imagination than in reality, the Stoic master wrote, because they fear things that may never happen. And he added, with an almost uncomfortable serenity, that while life is postponed, it passes. Worth repeating. While life is postponed, it passes. It is the executive who promises himself he will rest when the promotion comes through. It is the mother who promises she will breathe when the children grow up. It is the young man who promises he will live when the diploma arrives. And one day he looks back and realizes that his entire life was lived in waiting mode. 40 years passed in a waiting room. The soul grew old waiting for permission to begin. And no one ever gave that permission because it never came from the outside. It was always an inner button and no one ever pressed it. Anxiety, in the Senecan view, is not a new disease. It is the price of a mind that insists on living in a time that does not yet exist. And the problem is that the body does not distinguish real danger from imagined danger. A late report triggers the same hormones as a lion at the mouth of the cave. A difficult conversation on Friday takes over Wednesday, Thursday, Friday morning, and reaches the actual moment with the nervous system already in ruins. With his characteristic calm, the philosopher would have said that one has suffered 3 times over a single event, and that 2 of those sufferings were completely invented. This is not weakness. This is an untrained mind. A mind that no one taught to stay. A mind that learned to anticipate, but never learned to inhabit. And there is a curious detail about this anticipation. Most of the things feared never happen. A study conducted by American researchers around the phenomenon of chronic worry showed that the overwhelming majority of worries reported by participants over the course of weeks did not come true. Even so, those same worries caused, in the bodies of those participants, real physical symptoms. Headaches, insomnia, muscular tension, digestive changes. The thinker from Cordoba had already said this centuries earlier, with an almost identical sentence. Man tortured himself with futures that nature would never bring, and he lost, in those imaginary tortures, the only days he actually had. That is why serenity is not a matter of luck. It is a matter of training the imagination. An unrestrained imagination, handed over to the worst-case scenario, turns any week into a hell. A trained imagination, anchored in the present, turns any week into something bearable, even in difficult circumstances. And if the future pulls from one side, the past pulls from the other. A good part of human suffering is silent rumination. It is the conversation that should not have happened, revisited at 3 a.m. It is the poorly written email, reread mentally for days. It is the decision from 10 years ago, turned into constant proof that the person is worthless. That weight was observed with great clarity. Memory, when used to punish oneself, ceases to be memory and becomes torture. The past, for the wise man, serves as a lesson. For the restless man, it serves as a prison. And the difference between one and the other lies not in what happened, but in how one looks at what happened. 2 men may have lost everything. One gets up and rebuilds. The other spends 20 years arguing mentally with ghosts. The second keeps living the day of the loss every day, and that is why he cannot live any other day. There is a universal scene that illustrates this. Someone wakes up in the middle of the night, 3 a.m, and the mind delivers, in high definition, a scene from 10 years ago. A humiliation, a sentence that should never have been said, a choice that now seems absurd. And lying there in the dark, the body sweating, the brain insists on revisiting every detail, as if it could change what has already been. This, in the ancient language, would be described as a man trapped in his own time. Not real time, which moves forward, but a mental time that stayed frozen at a single point. It is a sophisticated form of dying while still alive. Not of the body, but of the life available. Because every minute spent that way is a minute of the present that never actually happened. And that is how one arrives at 60 with the feeling that, although one has lived so much, one has lived so little. What makes this cycle even denser is the company one chooses. And here, Senecan philosophy is surprisingly modern. Entire pages were dedicated to warning Lucilius about the dangers of the wrong company. Whoever lives with the restless becomes restless. Whoever lives with the envious absorbs envy. Whoever lives with the noisy crowd returns home poorer than when they left. A poverty that is not measured in money, but in the amount of oneself lost along the way. It was recommended, with a phrase that sounds almost harsh, to withdraw from the crowd. And it is curious to think about that today, because the crowd, now, enters the pocket. It fits inside an app. It arrives while the coffee cools on the kitchen table. A finger swipes up, and hundreds of lives pass before the eyes in seconds. An impeccable couple in Tuscany. A 20-year-old entrepreneur buying an apartment in Miami. A distant friend celebrating a job title in London. Each scroll is a small erosion of peace. Not because those lives are fake, but because the comparison between the edited version of thousands of lives and the raw version of one's own life will never be fair. And the brain, which evolved to compare itself with the local tribe, now compares itself with the entire world. It is biologically impossible to come out whole from that math. Whoever wants peace must choose very carefully what enters into them. People, books, conversations, habits. Everything charges a silent tax. A dinner with someone bitter costs 3 days of bad mood. An entire morning immersed in catastrophic news costs a week of hope. A text conversation with someone who lives in crisis costs a night of sleep. None of this is noticed at the moment it happens, but the price is charged, always, with interest, in the form of a diffuse malaise. That feeling that something is wrong, but you don't quite know what. Senecan philosophy knew very well what. It was the silent build-up of garbage that no one had filtered. In one of the letters to Lucilius, he reports his return home after the popular spectacles of Rome, with the feeling of being worse off than when he had left. In the arenas, the crowd got excited by blood, by violence, by competition, and the philosopher observed how that collective energy contaminated even those who were not participating. Crossing those streets on his way back home produced, inside him, a strange agitation, an irritation without cause, a shadow of cruelty that was not his own. This, he wrote, was the price of having exposed himself to the crowd. And it is striking how that observation, made 20 centuries ago, describes what one feels today after spending 2 hours scrolling through a newsfeed. You are not directly involved in any tragedy, but you come out of it as if you had participated in all of them. The nervous system does not properly distinguish information received in bulk from experience lived in bulk, and the soul foots the bill. The Senecan concept of moral contagion was not mystical. It was empirical observation. Moderate men, after spending weeks with a group of excesses, began to behave in similar ways. Serene men, after working close to hot-tempered men, absorbed small irritations that were not their own. Honest men, after living with flatterers, gradually lost the ability to say what they thought, and the conclusion came with an almost uncomfortable coldness. No one comes out immune from prolonged companionship. The mind is permeable. Permeability is its characteristic. And the only possible defense is conscious curation. To choose, with attention, who comes in. To choose, with even more attention, who stays. An American social researcher, Nicholas Christakis, showed in studies published over the past few decades that habits, moods, and even diseases spread through social networks like epidemics. A friend of a friend can, without knowing it, significantly alter someone's average mood. The Roman observation anticipated this, without data spreadsheets, only with attention. An attention that modernity, with all its screens, has almost lost. Before moving on, a pause. A small pause, made just to breathe. If this video has been offering something that makes a difference in your day, there is a simple invitation in the pinned first comment, one that deepens this philosophical practice in silence, far from the algorithm. Whoever wants will find a beginning there. Whoever prefers keeps going. Each person's rhythm is its own path. And that is why the proposal of a simple life, Senecan at its core, is not a renunciation. It is a cleansing. The truly rich person, he writes to Lucilius, is the one who needs little. That sentence needs to be digested slowly. Needing little is not the same as having little. Needing little is an inner condition. It is being free from the blackmail that excess imposes. Because everything that is accumulated must be maintained. Every maintenance requires money. Every sum of money requires work. Every job requires time. And time, as Senecan philosophy never tired of repeating, is the only thing that does not come back. To simplify, therefore, is the opposite of giving up. It is to recover. It is to reduce the number of things that demand your energy every day, so that something is left over for what truly matters. A simple example helps. Consider a professional in a big American city. He lives in an apartment bigger than he needs, drives a car more expensive than he uses, keeps 3 streaming services he rarely watches, pays for a gym he goes to twice a month, eats out at restaurants because he doesn't have time to cook, and works long shifts in part to sustain all of that. The Roman philosopher would ask, with an almost provocative calm, what he would be willing to let go of in exchange for one peaceful afternoon. And the honest answer, almost always, is that he would let go of many things, but he doesn't know where to start, because every object and every subscription has already become a piece of his identity. Life has wrapped itself around the things, and now he does not own them. They own him. That is the silent inversion that Stoic philosophy fought against. It is the same one that runs through any generation that confuses having with being. The thinker from Cordoba lived in an interesting paradox. He himself was a rich man, extremely rich. He owned properties, slaves, positions, influence. And he was accused, during his lifetime and after his death, of hypocrisy for preaching simplicity while living in comfort. He answered that accusation with rare clarity. He said he did not preach poverty, but detachment, and that he was not yet a wise man, only someone on the path. He said it was possible to have without being owned, that the difference between one man and another lay not in how much he owned, but in how he would behave if, from one day to the next, everything were taken from him. A man who loses everything and collapses was never truly free. A man who loses everything and continues being what he was, that man found true wealth. This distinction is subtle, and it saves one from false asceticism. It is not necessary to throw everything away. It is necessary not to depend inwardly on any of it. That is why Stoic philosophy has survived for centuries. It is not a manual of renunciation. It is a manual of inner freedom, applicable in any material context. Here enters a concept that modernity has demonized, and that was defended with intensity: leisure. Not leisure as laziness, but leisure as mental space. In the work On Leisure, the author of the Moral Letters defends that the wise man, even when withdrawn from public duties, remains in the service of humanity, because he thinks, studies, writes, contemplates. An implicit question is left hanging that has crossed the centuries. What is the use of a man who acts a lot, but never thinks? Modern culture answered with every possible marketing pitch that he is useful for being productive, and that is why exhaustion has become social currency. Sleeping little has become a virtue. Being exhausted has become proof that things are going well, and rest, true rest, the kind in which nothing happens, has become waste. The Stoic master would burst out laughing at that if he were in the mood for it. Without leisure, there is no reflection. Without reflection, there is no direction. Without direction, each day is a chain reaction. You get up reacting to the alarm clock. You react to email before your coffee. You react to traffic. You react to your boss. You react to notifications. You react to family demands. You go to bed reacting to insomnia. And the whole day passes without a single conscious choice having been made. The unexamined life, said the Stoic tradition, is not a life, it is only movement. Socrates before it said the same thing. Marcus Aurelius, after it, would repeat it. It is astonishing how that same message travels across cultures and centuries. Perhaps because it touches on something the human being avoids with all his strength. Stopping to look at himself. Looking at yourself is scary, because often, whoever looks at themselves discovers that they are in the wrong place, with the wrong people, doing the wrong things, and it is easier to keep running than to face that. Aristotle, in a time before Roman philosophy, had already pointed to something similar in his reflection on the good life. He said that contemplative leisure was, among all human activities, the highest, because it did not serve any external end. It was an end in itself, an activity that dignified the human being by allowing him to exercise the highest part of his nature, thought. Part of that tradition was inherited by the author of the Moral Letters and translated into everyday practice. An hour well spent in silence, with a good book in hand, or simply with one's own thoughts organized, was worth more than weeks of productive agitation. That sounds almost absurd to the modern ear, but it is precisely because it sounds absurd that it needs to be said. A culture that has lost the value of silent thought is condemned to permanent inner turbulence. There is no way around it. And what comes next, about the daily practice of that silence, is where Stoic philosophy finally cuts to the bone. Simplifying, then, is an act of courage. It is not running away from reality. It is finally facing it. It is cutting commitments that only exist to please. It is reducing your social circle so that it holds only those who add value. It is reviewing subscriptions, bills, debts, habits. It is relearning how to say no without guilt. Each thing subtracted from life gives back a piece of freedom, he wrote to Lucilius. And in the end, you are left with little, but everything that is left has meaning. That is a proposal very different from the one the world offers. The world promises fullness in accumulation. Senecan philosophy promises fullness in choice. And when the viewer looks honestly at their own week, they realize that half of what they do is born of inertia. It is only continuing to do what one already does, because stopping would require too much explaining. The simple life, understood in the Senecan way, begins with a silent inventory. Which commitments exist by purpose, which exist by habit, which relationships nourish, which only consume, which objects serve, which only take up space, which thoughts are useful, which are noise. Without that inventory, any promise of calm is an illusion, because calm does not descend from the sky. It is built, day by day, in what you accept, in what you refuse, in what you let go. And that inventory requires honesty, an honesty that most people don't want to have with themselves, because it reveals, for example, that that old group of friends has not made sense for years. That job is paid in money and charged in soul. That debt was taken on to impress people who don't even remember your name. That relationship continues out of fear of starting over, not out of love for continuing. No one likes to look at those truths, but it is only by looking at them that one can finally begin to let go. And for that inventory to happen, you need, above all, a resource that modernity has almost driven to extinction: silence. The Stoic master wrote at night when Rome was sleeping, because only then did the mind find the sharpness needed to think. He told Lucilius that he lived in a noisy building with a bathhouse right below, and that he had learned to filter out the external noise, but that he knew with clarity that the internal noise was much harder to silence. Silence, at first, is uncomfortable. That is honest. Someone who spends a decade with headphones in their ears, a screen in their hand and a television in the background, when they try to stay 10 minutes in silence, feels something close to panic. It is a detoxification. The nervous system is accustomed to a constant bombardment, and the absence of stimulation is experienced as though something is missing. After a few days, silence begins to give back what the stimuli had been stealing. Complete thoughts, one's own ideas, named emotions, subtle perceptions. That intuition that had been buried under notifications begins to speak again. Simple things were suggested: a walk without headphones, a meal without a screen, a train ride looking out the window and not at the phone, a Friday dinner with the radio turned off, 10 minutes a day seated doing absolutely nothing, not as a productivity technique, but as mental hygiene, because the mind, without rest, becomes the worst company possible. And it is curious to think that most people pay more attention to oral hygiene than to mental hygiene. They brush their teeth twice a day, but in 20 years they have never stopped for 10 minutes without stimulation. And then they wonder why they feel this restlessness that is hard to name. The ancient answer is simple. No one can stand being bombarded all the time and call that life. There exists, within Stoic philosophy, a tradition of the daily examination. The author of the Moral Letters practiced something that Christian monks, centuries later, would call the examination of conscience. He told Lucilius that every night, before sleeping, he would mentally review the day, not to punish himself, but to learn. He would ask himself what he had said, what he had done, what he had felt, where he had rushed, where he had gotten irritated without reason, where he had wasted time on things that were not worth it. And, on the following day, he would try to adjust. That exercise, apparently simple, produced something rare: a life with direction, a life in which the mistakes of the previous day became material for the next day instead of becoming dead weight. A life that gained, little by little, an inner direction instead of merely responding to what the world commanded. From silence is born the possibility of constancy. That is a central concept in Stoicism, and the work on the happy life develops it especially. Constancy, or constantia, is the ability to remain the same in the face of the oscillations of the world. It is inner firmness, not coldness nor indifference. It is not becoming a euphoric man just because a compliment arrived, nor becoming a destroyed man just because a criticism appeared. It is maintaining, in praise and in criticism, in abundance and in scarcity, in health and in illness, the same center. The wise man, said the philosopher, is like a rock facing the waves. He is wet, hit, pounded, but he continues being what he is. And the opposite of that is the average man, whose mood depends on the last message received, on the last meeting, on the last sideways glance in the elevator. Modern life, with its flood of stimuli, makes constancy extremely difficult. The phone vibrates and the mood changes. A piece of bad news comes in, and the whole day sinks. A comment on social media, and the night turns into insomnia. The Stoic tradition would say that this fragility is not natural. It was trained. It was trained by a culture that taught the human being to live from reaction instead of from choice. And the path to reverse that is slow, but possible. It goes through silence, through leisure, through reading, through reflection, and above all, through clarity about what one controls and what one does not control. That is perhaps the most famous principle of Stoicism, and several letters repeat it. There are things that depend on us and things that do not. To suffer over what does not depend on us is to waste life. The weather does not depend on us. Traffic does not depend on us. What others think of us does not depend on us. The economy does not depend on us. The boss's opinion does not depend on us. The action of the beloved woman does not depend on us. But the interpretation depends on us. The response depends on us. The focus depends on us. The time we spend ruminating depends on us. The inner posture in the face of what happened depends on us. All the serenity that Stoic philosophy promises is born from shifting the energy, getting out of what one does not control and concentrating on what one does control. It sounds simple. It is simple, but it is not easy, because a mind trained the other way spends decades burning itself out in battles it will never win, arguing mentally with people who have already left, complaining about decisions that have already been made, demanding impossible standards from itself. With his master's patience, the philosopher would say that as long as you dedicate energy to what cannot be changed, what can be changed will keep waiting forever. Epictetus, a near contemporary of that same tradition, taught his students an apparently trivial exercise. He asked that at the beginning of the day, each one mentally list what depended on themselves and what did not. And that, throughout the day, whenever a frustration appeared, the person should ask themselves immediately in which column that element belonged. If it was in the column of what depended on them, it was time to act. If it was in the column of what did not depend on them, it was time to let go. That small gesture, done repeatedly, trains the brain in a kind of discernment that modernity has almost lost. And it is curious that, in the middle of the 21st century, millions of people pay for therapies, apps, and courses that, deep down, are trying to reteach what Epictetus and the Stoic master were already teaching for free, with a clarity that required no apparatus. The information was there, but no one was practicing it. And philosophy without practice becomes decoration. And there is an exercise, Senecan in spirit, that illuminates this entire philosophy. It is the exercise of looking at one's own death. That sounds heavy, but it is, in fact, one of the greatest liberators philosophy has ever offered. In On the Shortness of Life, it is written that death is not the end that approaches little by little. It is a companion from the very first day. Each day lived is a day consumed. And the only reason why people waste so much time is because they act as if they were infinite. Marcus Aurelius, centuries later, wrote almost the same thing in his meditations. Act, he said, as if this were your last day, without drama, without rush, but without postponement. That reflection, traditionally called memento mori, is not morbid. It is clarifying, because when someone truly accepts that life has a deadline, many things shrink. The fight with the neighbor becomes small. A 10-year grudge becomes ridiculous. The ambition to impress people who don't even like you becomes pathetic. Comparison with a stranger on the internet becomes almost a joke. And, on the other side, many things grow. A dinner with someone you love becomes important. A walk at sunset gains depth. A long conversation with an old friend starts to be experienced as an event. Finitude, when faced head-on, gives back the correct hierarchy of things. It reorganizes life. The man who remembers he is going to die, wrote the thinker from Cordoba, is the only one who knows how to live. And most people today live pretending that death is somebody else's problem. A problem for later, a problem for old people. And meanwhile, they waste decades on trivialities. The Australian nurse Bronnie Ware, who worked for years in palliative care, compiled the 5 most common regrets of end-of-life patients in a book that became a global reference. No one, absolutely no one, said they wished they had worked more. Many said they wished they had had the courage to live the life they wanted and not the one others expected. Many said they wished they had kept in touch with their friends. Many said they wished they had allowed themselves to be happier. Many said they wished they had expressed their feelings throughout their lives. If he were alive, the Roman philosopher would only nod his head. He had said all of that, in other words, 2,000 years ago, and no one listened. It is as if every human generation had to rediscover, through pain, what the previous generation already knew. And Stoic philosophy is, at its core, an effort to spare that pain, an invitation to arrive earlier, to discover, while there is still time and not on the deathbed, what truly matters. There is another Senecan practice connected to this reflection on finitude that deserves attention. It is called praemeditatio malorum, the meditation on evils. The author of the Moral Letters advised Lucilius to, from time to time, calmly imagine the worst that could happen. The loss of a loved one, the loss of the job, the loss of health, the loss of possessions. Not to torture oneself, but to inoculate against fear. What one imagines with serenity before it happens, when it happens, finds the soul prepared. And what one imagines with dread before it happens, dissipates energy for nothing. The difference between one and the other is the posture with which one looks at the possibility. Imagining loss calmly trains gratitude. Imagining loss with terror trains anxiety. And most of the time, the same facts can be looked at in both ways. It is an inner choice, a choice that the tradition insisted was available to anyone. The simple life, then, reveals itself as something very different from what the word suggests. Simple is not primitive. Simple is essential. It is a life in which what is left is what matters. It is a life with fewer possessions, but with more space. With fewer commitments, but with more presence. With fewer blind ambitions, but with more authentic desires. With less external noise, but with more inner voice. It is a life that does not impress anyone at first glance, but that sustains whoever lives it. Senecan philosophy emerged in a time when that proposal sounded radical, and it is curious that 2,000 years later, it sounds even more radical, because there has never been a culture so organized to produce the very unrest it fought against. An American researcher, Cal Newport, professor of computer science and author of several books on focus and digital minimalism, has argued, in works published over the last decade, that human attention has become the most contested resource on the planet. In Digital Minimalism, published in 2019, he describes an entire economy that sustains itself by stealing, every day, small pieces of the attention of billions of people. And he observes something the Roman tradition would have recognized immediately. Each second of that stolen attention is taken, invisibly, from the human capacity to think, feel, live deeply. It is as if each app, without one noticing, charged an invisible tax on inner life. And at the end of the year, when counting how much one has lived, almost nothing is left. Newport does not use Stoic language, but he describes the same problem, and he points, curiously, to the same path. Less. Fewer stimuli, fewer apps, fewer automatic connections, more conscious choice of what enters and what stays. There is a Latin expression, originally coined by the poet Horace in his epistles, in the first book, Epistle 6, and later taken up by the Stoic Roman tradition, that sums it all up with disconcerting precision. Nihil admirari, be astonished at nothing. Not in the sense of cold indifference, but in the sense of not letting yourself be dragged along by every new thing that appears. A man who is astonished by everything is a man who runs after everything. A man who has already seen, calmly, how things work, no longer lets himself be seduced by the latest headline, the latest release, the latest shout of fashion. He stays. He observes. He chooses. And what he chooses often is to remain where he is, doing what he was doing, with a little more presence. Not because there is no world out there, but because he has discovered that a good part of the world out there is well-packaged noise. And well-packaged noise is, perhaps, the quietest enemy of the good life. That is why the simple life should not be confused with a small life. A man can live in a big city, hold an important profession, carry heavy responsibilities, and still practice what Roman philosophy taught. Simplicity is not an address. It is a posture. It is the way you wake up. It is the way you respond to a provocation. It is the way you sleep after a hard day. A simple man can have a full calendar, but not a full mind. He can have commitments, but not be possessed by them. He can have money, but not be ruled by it. The difference always lies in the inner axis. And the inner axis is built slowly, over the course of years of small repeated choices, until it becomes second nature, that stable center the thinker from Cordoba spoke about, and that no one can steal, because no one, deep down, knows where it has been kept, and how the very author of this philosophy faced his final hour, which we will see in a few moments, is the most impressive coherence he left behind as a legacy. And that is where the synthesis appears. Living without agitation does not mean abandoning the world. It is not about leaving the city, nor about dropping everything and going to live in a cabin. That, for most people, is just one more form of escape. Living without agitation is remaining in the world, but ceasing to be dragged along by it. It is waking up and choosing your own rhythm. It is deciding what will enter your mind in the morning. It is choosing who you have lunch with. It is refusing invitations that only wear you out. It is accepting tasks that make sense. It is turning off the screen when the day has ended. It is going to bed early, even if the culture finds it strange. It is saying goodbye to dreams that were not yours. And it is recognizing in the end that peace is not a place one arrives at. It is a daily practice. It is a set of small repeated choices, day after day, that build, little by little, the kind of soul Roman philosophy described. The author of the Moral Letters ended his own life with a serenity that became legendary. Condemned to death by the Emperor Nero, who had been his student, he received the order with the same calm with which he had received decades earlier positions and honors. He gathered his friends around him. He dictated a few final reflections, and he faced the end, as he had said, his whole life, that it should be faced, without drama, without revolt, without attachment. Not because life did not have value, precisely because it had had value. He had written years earlier that the problem was not dying, but never having truly lived, and upon reaching his own end, he was consistent with what he had taught. That is rare, very rare. Most philosophers write one thing and live another. He, despite all his contradictions in life, died the way he had said one should die. And that final consistency is, perhaps, the strongest testimony that his philosophy was not just rhetoric. It was a method of inner organization, a way of looking at the world, a daily training that produced, in the end, a soul capable of facing whatever came. Perhaps the viewer is searching, without knowing it, for the wrong life. Perhaps the exhaustion he feels is not a lack of anything more. Perhaps it is an excess of everything. Perhaps what he needs is not a new goal, a new course, a new city, a new version of himself. Perhaps he needs simply less, fewer objects, less noise, less comparison, less imagined future, less ruminated past. Fewer noisy people around, fewer tabs open in his head, and from inside that less, to rediscover what Roman philosophy said with an almost uncomfortable calm. Life is long enough if it is truly lived, and it only truly begins when someone has the courage to stop running and finally sit down, in silence, with themselves, without fear of what they will find there. Nothing more needs to be done. Nothing more needs to be added. What was missing was never more. It was always less. If something inside you slowed down while you were listening to these words, that is the beginning. You don't need to change everything today. It's enough to keep breathing, with a little more attention, a little more silence, a little more choice. If this space makes sense for your journey, leaving a like is a simple way of saying you want more reflections like this one. Subscribing to the channel is allowing this companionship to continue, without demanding anything, only offering. And if you have already felt that you want to deepen this journey of silence and simplicity, the Members Club exists precisely for those who wish to walk with a little more closeness, without rush, without a crowd. See you at the next gathering.